I'll just briefly represent to you that we have Gerard McCullough from the University of Minnesota, Bill Huneke, who many of you or all of you know formerly of the STB, Mark Burton from the University of Tennessee, and Russs Pittman from the United States Department of Justice Antitrust Division. It's a great sort of eclectic set of economists who collectively have been studying the rail industry for, let's call it 120 years or so. So I'm looking forward to their responses and their input and thoughts, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. I would like to begin in terms of a set of questions to the panel, and let me just ask all of them. Gerard, maybe you could go first, and then we'll go down the row. As economists, you are both consumers of research and producers of research. And in that capacity, what I might ask you, and this, we're sitting in Washington, D.C., in terms of policy and the takeaways from that research, there's sort of a great joy of consuming and producing research by itself. But the question is, what do we know? What have we learned over the last decade that we didn't know about the economics and policy in the freight rail industry? And what do we still need to know? What have we learned over the last decade, and what do we still need to know? And I especially want to emphasize that latter question because there are very curious young people in the room who would like to have good topics. So this can be lessons that you have learned from your own research, from other people's research. But Gerard, if you could just start us off,
Sure.
please.
So it seems to be one area, and this isn't so much directly policy oriented, but more with the idea of understanding the industry better, and that's to focus research on the relationship between the rail industry and particular industries. Much of the research up till now has been kind of industry-specific cost functions. The railroads have economies of scale, economies of scope, et cetera, and there were certainly reasons for that. And then on the demand side, again, it was this kind of aggregate demand for freight, and then how that will affect modal shares. If you look at the research in industrial organization, much of the work there is about particular industries, what's happening in food, what's happening in agriculture, what's happening in different kinds of energy industries, distribution. And lots of interesting results come up there, and there's a lot of good data there that I think young economists could use to get to that kind of the complex relationships that railroads have with many different kinds of industries. And we actually heard some stuff this morning from Russ and others on what happens when you look at railroads and coal. We will hear some more this afternoon on railroads and grain. But when you think about it, railroads and chemicals is interesting, railroads and automobiles is interesting, and other industries. So I would like to see more work done along that line. And then with that, I think, and now this is another topic we heard about today, geographic information systems, all this good geographic data could complement that kind of work. So I've got there's a group at the University of Minnesota now that I sit near. I don't really work with them, and they're doing the geography of agricultural production, how ag production is changing even around the United States, and then how that affects food security. And I've been thinking the geography of agricultural production, how it's changing, how that affects railroad operations. But then you say the geography of steel production, how that has changed, how that affects railroads, and how railroads are affecting that. Those would all be kind of interesting topics that we haven't spent enough time understanding.
Gerard, just to let you know, we have some wonderfully bright young economists at Georgetown, some of whom are so bright, my colleague Fernando Monte, that he's going to answer all those geography questions later this afternoon in our rapid fire round. So Fernando, you're on the spot. Bill?
Well, when I came to the board in 2001, it was shortly after one of my favorite people, Linda Morgan, put in the new merger rules. And it was really a timeout on mergers after the industry had gone through a couple of decades of consolidation and restructuring. And at that time, I remember one of the first things I did was read a really good long paper by John Bitson on the econometrics of the railroad industry and looking at where it was in terms of the economies of size and density, and seemed to indicate at the time at least the industry was getting to the point where it was somewhat optimally configured. I think now, particularly with Hunter Harrison at CSX, and he made a lot of noise last year about having a merger, it would be very worthwhile to do some deep econometric analysis on the structure, the size, the economies of the industry, using things like translog cost functions and trying to figure out, is the industry optimally sized? What's the optimal size? Would a merger make sense from an efficiency standpoint? Because one of the things the board's going to have to work on in the future is maybe a merger, and not just one merger, but maybe a couple, 3 mergers to figure out what's the right size for the industry. And that to me says we need more econometric analysis, we need to do cost analysis, we need to figure out what the answers to those questions.
Mark.
I have a soapbox around here someplace. One of my favorite topics is
You're standing on it.
yes, I am, thank you. I think over the last 4 or 5 years, we've done a really good job of beginning to consider different ways to change rail policy to make it better. There have been an awful lot of discussions, and some of them noisy and some of them very productive, about different ways that we may modify the regulatory structure or the policy structure to bring about improvements. The fundamental question in my mind, however, is what are the potential gains to be had through policy changes? One of the most difficult questions, I think, to answer is whether or not the functioning of rail markets, collectively or individually, constitutes allocative efficiency, and if not, if there are deviations and efficiency gains to be had, how great are those gains? That tells us how much value there is in trying to modify policy. Without knowing that, we kind of know how hard it is to make policy and how hard it is to make policy changes, but without answering questions about potential efficiency gains, we don't really know what we would get in the bargain for that. And so I think that that's a critical question to answer. It's also probably one of the more difficult questions to deal with, and to come up with a credible estimate of what potential economic gains could be had through any sort of alternative policies. But before we move too far toward investing a lot more emotional and intellectual energy and looking at policy changes, I'd like to know what the gains are to be had. And it requires probably a more macro view of the world than I'm used to having. So.
Mark, thank you very much. Russ.
I find myself in agreement with everything I've heard up to now. I would make the friendly amendment, I think, to all 3 points, since we're advising the young, to cast your net more widely and look internationally for some of the same questions we've been talking about. Bill was talking about cost functions. There is an extensive literature on using cost functions on not only economies of density or economies of system size, but, for example, on the question in Europe that we've been talking about a little bit today, of vertical separation versus third-party access. David, in his paper, was looking only at the 2 extremes, horizontal separation and vertical separation. In Europe, a lot of the debate, as was mentioned, is between third-party access to an integrated railway and complete vertical separation. Brussels really wants these countries to do complete vertical separation. The best econometric evidence suggests you get a lot of the benefits of competition by just opening up to third-party access without complete vertical separation. But it's, as these econometric works go, it's not it's not a real robust finding. You need to make a lot of assumptions to do these cost functions. There's a lot of work left to be done. There's a lot more recent work to be done. Another way of saying this is that if we want to apply some of David and Shanna's insights from their theory, there's a whole lot of econometric estimation that would go into estimating what some of those parameters are. And sometimes we have a pretty good idea what they are, and sometimes we don't. And that leads further into David and Shanna's paper on, again, if we're talking to the young about interesting questions, there are still some big international questions. There's still some countries where the railway is basically unreformed. India is an example. China is something of an example. Russia is only partway to reform. Ukraine is only partway to reform. There's a lot out there to look at and say, you know, there are debates going on in most of these countries. What should we do with this old monopoly railway? It'd be good if we had better econometric results. It'd be good if we had great people like the people in this room talking about this. And how might you think Russia's railway would be reorganized compared to Brazil's? And why would one or the other be a better outcome for that country?
Thank you very much. Let me ask this, Russ. You raised the issue of international. In the last election cycle, and of course in the first 6 months of the new administration, we've seen the issues of international trade come to the fore. We've also seen issues of discussions of infrastructure come to the fore. Are there lessons from the economic community, as represented by the four of you, for the rail industry, the role that infrastructure and trade issues can play, do play, will play, should play as we look forward? What advice would you offer? And let's just maybe do it in the inverse order. We'll go back and forth, and at some point I'll start in the middle. Russ?
I don't know that I have any special insight into this. I mean, we all know that the U.S. railways are devote a lot of attention and are very productive in terms of supporting import and export traffic. One of the hallmarks that we've already talked about here today is how much private investment there is in the U.S. railways, but the U.S. railways and the ports and the roads do depend on government funding as well. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Tiger program that many of you may know about, that's not particularly focused on railways, but it's been a grant program for capital improvements in ports, for example, and inland ports through the country that, as I understand it, the president's budget would zero out, which would be a loss for some particular communities. On the other hand, of course, I mean, we don't need to get into the ideas, or we can get into the ideas that the president has proposed to try to leverage government money into expanding to a lot more other infrastructure. So that may be a whole other seminar's worth. But I think we're all agreed that the railways, while they are the U.S. railways and the North American railways, while they're very successful in bringing in huge amounts of private investment, also are dependent on complementary government investments.
Yeah. Mark?
The Association of American Railroads, John's group, did some work recently to try and capture the degree of rail traffic that is in one way or another dependent on trade. And I was a little surprised at the size of the number. I mean, I think I thought that it would be a large number. It was probably 10 or so % greater than what I thought it would be. So it is very, very clear that as an industry, the railroad industry depends heavily on the ability to continue foreign trade. There are some very specific effects that I've encountered recently, even more recently than that. We're doing some work taking a look at coal in the eastern U.S. and how changing patterns of coal usage and production are likely to change the rail picture in the eastern U.S. One of the things that became very clear to me very quickly was that the answer you get and which railroads will be affected to what degree depends a great deal on what happens with export coal. Now, export markets are traditionally fickle, and so predicting that is very difficult. But the fact is that both CSX and Norfolk Southern will be profoundly affected by what happens with export coal. I guess when I was thinking about trade, I was thinking about containers. That's what we all think about. But at least in terms of the Eastern railroads, it's going to make a lot of difference, the trade policy, if it inhibits or promotes the ability to export goods. One final thought on this, and that is, we talk a lot about railroad infrastructure, associated port infrastructure, other infrastructures that are used in freight transportation. These are infrastructures that have long lives, and we're all familiar with that and some of the difficulties that imposes. We have a system of freight transportation that over the last generation or two has emerged to meet an increasingly global world. And there are a lot of facilities in place that represent both public and private sector investments that are there to facilitate trade. Any action that inhibits that will cut down on the usefulness of those investments, and I don't know that we understand that.
Bill, your thoughts?
Well, I was very impressed with the work that the AAR did in showing how big the railroad's dependence on foreign trade is and how important that is to them, particularly when you think that their coal business, there is some export coal, but that seems to be declining. The petroleum business clearly is very volatile and declining. And then the chemical business may be there for them, but you would think that the thing that could really help the railroad industry keep going is the intermodal and trade. And that just seems so important to me, that looking at how intermodal might hold up and how their ability to take traffic off the highways would hold up would be really important to the future of the country.
Gerard?
Yeah, so John Gray's number was 42% of carloads and about 35% of rail revenue. So it's QED on trade. I have the last word though on infrastructure. So it seems to me that there is this $1 trillion gorilla out there somewhere. And if I understand it, the idea is that the government will provide tax credits and an equity cushion, whatever that is, and that somehow will draw $1 trillion in financing, I guess, from the banking world, from Wall Street banks, who did such a great job financing housing construction before, and now they're going to finance infrastructure. But it seems to me the really important question from a transport economist and rail economist perspective is how then do they raise the money to pay the banks back this $1 trillion? And if that's through highway, in the case of highways at least, if that's through highway tolls, and I understand that might be one of the, has been talked about at least, then that strikes me as a pretty good idea. I mean, and tolls are not just congestion tolls. Pricing highways through tolls has a way of focusing the money on those parts of the highway network that need to get fixed or built up. And also, if the tolls are designed well, they could eliminate cross subsidies to heavy trucks. All of those would be good things, I think, for the rail industry. So if the program goes through, and if it doesn't lead to another financial recession, I think that would be a good thing for the rail industry.
So economists have focused on congestion pricing for a long, long time now. Let me put each of you on the spot. More congestion pricing on toll roads, yes or no? Gerard, yes or no?
Yes.
Bill?
Absolutely, yes.
Mark?
Yes.
The
Russ?
views expressed are not necessarily those of you. Yes.
I'll take that as a yes. We've just killed the prospects of congestion pricing as a result of the unanimity among economists. Let me switch, if I could, to the regulatory arena. Mark, you mentioned in response to my opening question the lessons that we seem to be learning about how to implement, I thought you said, sort of smarter policies, but there were questions about how we measure efficiency gains from policies. Last year, we had the STB Reauthorization Act that granted greater independence to the STB, bringing it out from under the Department of Transportation. How do you each see that change as affecting the conduct or behavior of firms and the agency? Is this a good thing, a bad thing, or something for future research? And let's start in the middle. Bill, you were at that. Now, you don't have the excuse that the views expressed are anyone others than your own now. So,
Well, I never felt when I was at the STB that somebody at DOT was overlooking me from a policy perspective. Because although the STB was administratively housed inside DOT, we were decisionally independent. So that if the Department of Transportation wanted to file something in one of our litigations, they would file it just like somebody from DOJ would file it. And then the board would look at it and consider it as it would other people who were filing briefs at the agency. In terms of more efficiency, I could see lots of more efficiencies on the administration and management of the agency. And it takes me back to one of those classic DOT programs where a former DOT secretary said, we've got to get rid of texting while driving. Well, everybody inside DOT was supposed to do this. My secretary at the time came to me and said, you know, I don't text. I don't know how to drive. Do I have to take the training class? I went to our HR director and I said, does she have to take the training class? Well, I can't tell you I have to go to DOT. Guess what DOT decided? She had to take the training class. There are a lot of training classes like that we used to get through DOT that now, for whatever reason, we don't have to do as much of that anymore. There are a lot of things that the agency had to do to conform to DOT's specifications that the agency doesn't have to do anymore. So in terms of running the agency, it may be a little bit more efficient, but I don't see a lot happening from a policy standpoint.
Russell, you've got a lot of international experience. I don't know if you can weigh in on this or not, but it dawns on me that some regulatory agencies in other countries are squarely part of the executive branch of government. Others are more independent. What's your experience from an international perspective?
Well, and with my usual disclaimer, I'll say this applies to antitrust as well.
Yes.
That there are different countries in the world where the competition authorities are in the government, and there are different countries in the world where they are more or less independent. It is definitely
including the United States.
I'm going to go there. I'm going to get there. It is definitely a danger in a country without well-established rule of law to have regulators and competition authorities in the government. I would say that without qualification. If you don't have a well-established rule of law, it is a definite danger because there is a real risk of getting political interference with what should be purely regulatory, purely antitrust law, purely competition law decisions. So that's number one. Number two, if you do have a well-established rule of law, and let me say I think we do in the US, we in the US actually have a little bit of an experiment there. We have two antitrust authorities. One is the FTC, an independent, one of the first, I think the second independent regulatory agency after the ICC, Department of Justice, Antitrust Division within the Department of Justice. I go all over the world telling people, make your competition agency separate. Make it whatever you can do under your constitution, under your regime, not politically connected. I don't know of anybody who believes that there are significant differences between DOJ and FTC in terms of antitrust enforcement, or if there are that are connected with some kind of political influence on DOJ. If there are those allegations, I haven't heard them, and I don't have any reason to think they exist. So I think, yes, it's a good idea to be independent. I'm with Bill. I don't expect policy differences from the change at STB for the same reason that I don't think on a day-to-day basis it makes much difference whether your merger goes before DOJ or FTC.
Mark, you or Gerard have follow-up thoughts on this issue?
Very, very little. I think on the whole, the Reauthorization Act was a very favorable thing. I think it did some very useful things, some of which we haven't had a chance to see implemented yet, but there are a lot of people in this room that know more about the STB than I do.
Okay. Gerard?
I had a view of this, and then I talked to Bill Huneke, and I'm in the process of changing my view of it, so I'm kind of hesitating. My prior on this was as follows, that a regulatory agency, there's this sort of division. You've got the regulated firms, you've got the regulatory agency, and then there's what Jean Tirole, the French economist, calls the political principle. So the agency reports to someone. It can report either to the executive branch, and then it's a non-independent agency, or it reports to Congress, and then it's, quote, independent. But then the question is, what does that mean to be independent if you, and what Tirole also points out is that the structure is that the political principle kind of exercises budget control over the regulatory agency. The agency exercises economic control over the regulated firms, and they have different incentives. So you have this kind of complicated game going on, and there's asymmetric information involved too. So the question then becomes, is there a difference in the incentives of an executive branch political principle versus a congressional political principle? And I went into it thinking, well, there is, that the DOT, the incentive of the secretary of the DOT is to keep the national rail system going and the rest of the national transportation system. So I think that makes the DOT secretary probably more pro-carrier, let's say, more pro-merger and more for solid rates. The incentive of Congress is multiple. They've got a multiple constituency, and so I think they would tend to be more shipper-oriented, more skeptical of mergers, more stricter about rate increases. And that's a good story. I think the story is probably not true, though, because it turns out that when the STB was set up, and this Bill educated me on this, even in the legislation which set the STB up, it's one of these really special independent agencies that reports simultaneously to the DOT and to Congress. Congress wrote that into the 95 Act. And then when it made the STB independent, it just strengthened that, okay? And it said, in fact, OMB can't do anything to the budget that we assign to the STB. So, and just one quick, I apologize for being a little bit long on this. There was another experiment, Russ, though, in 1985 when the CAV was put into the DOT. If you recall, they then approved 20 mergers, 20 airline mergers, okay? And then Congress said, wait a second, and pulled it out. So, and I had that in mind as well. But back to the STB, it seems certainly the STB now is completely independent of the executive branch, so not under any kind of influence from the Secretary of Transportation. But then the question becomes, open question, does it have to be, in budget terms, more responsive to Congress? Okay, more responsive to Congress. And there are people in this room who know a lot more than I would about, is that the case? But that's a possibility, I guess.
Could I just add one thing?
Please.
The one thing that the executive branch, meaning the president, can do and can still do today that it could do before was designate who the chairman of the agency was.
Right.
So when there was as long as there's an opening in the agency, and there are two today, the president can pretty much decide what the direction of the agency is by finding somebody who's congenial to his direction for the economy.
Yeah. And you're saying that's true independent of the fact that the STB is independent?
Correct, because that was true with DOT as well.
But there are 5, and there have to be 5, and they have terms of, or they're going to be 5, and they have,
So there's
They
3
have-
now, and they have 2 openings
and they
now.
have 5-year terms, and they have to be Democrat and Republican. I mean, there's
Right,
still
so
a
there's
kind of
3 of one
independence
party.
that's written into the, yeah.
So I want to segue from questions that are asked from up here to questions that are asked out there with one question, final question from me. And I have to preface it by saying that the great fun of being a moderator is that I put myself into the role of writing a PhD qualifying exam here. And I have a question in that spirit for the panelists, and you can be pretty quick, I think, of this. But I'm going to read you my PhD qualifying exam question for each of you. Nobel laureate George Stigler once wrote an article in which he observed that, quote, the literature of public regulation is so vast that it must touch on everything, but it touches seldom and lightly on the most basic question one can ask about regulation. Does it make a difference in the behavior of an industry? End quote. Bringing that observation to the rail industry, let me ask you each whether you see that the presence of regulation or the evolution of regulation as unfolded or will be unfolding by the STB is altering firm behavior, and if so, how? I can't revoke your PhD if you don't answer correctly. But
I was going to say, you've already had your chance with me once, and you let me off the hook.
Yeah.
I love this question, and I think it probably has to do with the way I was trained. If you look at the railroad industry, if you look at shippers, and you look at the attention that they pay to the regulatory process, it obviously matters to them. I mean, Stigler was also the one that said, this is something that will be competed for, and I think there's every evidence that both shippers and carriers compete for the favor of the regulatory process. So it must matter. There are some very specific areas where I think it is particularly important. Primarily the area of investment, and it may be just because I'm spending a lot of time looking at that right now, but I think that both the regulatory climate and the specific regulatory processes can influence investment significantly, and in an industry, again, where the investments are long-lived, that really matters. Yeah, I think that absolutely the regulatory process is important and affects all of the participants. That said, I'm forever amazed and somewhat comforted that other economic changes, market changes, can influence the industry much quicker and much more profoundly than can we as regulators.
other thoughts?
In terms of, if I can interpret your question broadly, whether the regulators and when and how they treat merger proposals has clearly, I would argue, had a big impact on the rail industry. And I will mention allegations. Many people think that the mergers allowed in the 90s went too far in concentrating business among this 80% among the top 4 railways in the US, and that the average rates charged stopped falling in the mid-2000s and started going back up. Many people would allege that, and this is probably connected also to the 2001 STB decision that Bill referred to that said, oh my God, look, we've allowed too many, or we've allowed enough mergers now, we're gonna make it harder to allow more. I think many people would argue that the STB in the 80s and 90s allowed too many mergers, allowed the industry to get too concentrated, and that the duopolists in the East and the duopolists in the West are not very competitive anymore, with all due respect to my friends in the audience who work for the duopolists in the East and the West.
Gerard, thoughts?
So, I mean, but that's with respect to, was Stigler talking about mergers there, or was he talking more about?
I'm interpreting this broadly, regulation. That's why Russ was thinking.
And my hook was the regulators
answering.
allowed the mergers, but point taken,
Russ is answering beyond strict
yes.
regulation, but to include mergers,
Fair point,
I think.
yes.
Because I think with respect to economic regulation, certainly the absence of regulation, if you think of deregulation as the absence of regulation, had a very significant effect. And I'm not sure about, it's hard to separate the effect of deregulation and the effect of the mergers econometrically. I mean, you can sort of think of it maybe as deregulation let the railroads make different kinds of service proposals in terms of contracts and unit trains and intermodal kinds of service. The mergers may have then enabled them to reduce the cost of providing those services, okay? But then back to this question of if there weren't regulation, if we didn't have this kind of residual regulatory power now, would the whole vector of railroad rates be that different? I don't know. I really wonder. It seems to me that so much of this now gets resolved in markets by firms, smart big firms talking to smart big railroads, that's kind of what you would expect. And I'm not sure regulation, maybe the potential for regulation has some effect, but I'm not sure it has a big effect.
Okay. Bill, final word, and then let's open it up to everyone.
And I know that Deb Miller, who's in the audience, occasionally puts this number out there, but you have to realize that so little of the railroad traffic is subject to regulation these days. I mean, if you just start with the fact of the 180 regulatory threshold, that knocks like 2/3 of the traffic out. And then anything that's is an exempt commodity that the ICC or STB exempted, that takes another 10% out. And then anything that goes by contract, you're taking another 10% out. Pretty soon, I think the last time Deb did this thing, it's like only 5% of rail traffic is subject to STB regulation. So I think there's not a lot there right now in terms of regulation. It may change, but not today.
Okay, let's open it up to the group. And again, following the protocol of this morning, if you could wait for the microphone and then identify yourself for the panelists.
John Gray, Association of American Railroads. I guess if I had to name one issue that I think is the most concerning, the most challenging long-term issue faced by the industry right now, that too, it would be market adaptation and the ability to continue to adapt to rather dramatic market changes that are going on right at this point in time. John, you pointed towards some of those in your opening slides, but there are many that are in addition to that are almost as big as those changes taking place. So, given the challenges of that area, could the members of the panel talk about two items related to that? One is the policy issues that they see around it, the economic policy issues that they see around it, and two is what are the research opportunities that those engender? You next.
Jump ball.
Well, I think that everybody in this room needs to think about the big issues in front of the agency more holistically. And one of the examples I would say is you need to think if the agency does anything about revenue adequacy, and if the agency does anything about open access, how those two interact. Because whatever the agency does on open access can't just be based on past pricing regimes that it used in a merger or an abandonment case. Because in a merger and abandonment case, what you're trying to do is with a merger, maintain competition that already exists. And with an abandonment, you're trying to maintain service. So the kind of access price that gets put in place then is going to be maybe marginal cost plus a little bit. If we open up access, then that opens the question of how much is the railroad going to be allowed to retain or get for the non-bottleneck part of its network. And if the agency puts in too draconian an access pricing regime, that could cause, I fear, and it would be worth doing some research on this, severe problems on the revenue adequacy front.
I completely agree. I don't think I ever wanted to hug you before. That is,
Please
Don't start now.
John, I think you remember the access paper that you all did here. You said, or the revenue adequacy paper, you said adequate for what? Revenues that are adequate for what? And I think that when you talk about unfolding markets, market changes, and adaptation, that one of the things that railroad revenues have to be is sufficient to foster that sort of adaptation. The fact is, the railroad industry in the last 5 or 10 years has gone through a number of great changes and a number of challenges, and it's weathered them very well. Investment's been consistent. There have been some traffic losses, some traffic rebounds, but the industry's done really well. And part of the reason that it's done well in this very uncertain environment is because the revenues have been adequate to foster that adaptation. And in terms of access, I think you're exactly right. That same ability to generate adequate revenues would have to be sustained by any sort of access pricing or access regime. And in a sense, all you've really done then is just move the problem from a retail to a wholesale level. And I think it'd be a real challenge.
Gerard, Russ? Nope.
So I took John's question, though, to be focusing not just on the agency, but on challenges. That, I don't think that's what you meant by the enemy, but the industry, right? The challenges that are facing the industry. And
This is John's last day at the AAR, by the way. Everybody be sure to send him, give him a hug on the way out.
how policy affects that. It seems to me that, going back to Staggers, that the real difference between the Staggers Act and all of the regulatory stuff that had gone before Staggers is that Staggers said that prices are at least as important as costs in allowing an industry to evolve and to face challenges. That whatever the challenges are, you're not going to be able to get at them by estimating accounting costs. Whatever the challenges are, they're going to be revealed by the prices, either that firms, your shippers are offering or that shippers are not offering. And so the way the industry evolves is by being able to respond to price signals. And it seems to me, again, especially now, the role of the regulator in a way is to do no harm, is to not get in between that process of firms saying to their partners, railroads, here's what we need, here's what we don't need, okay? And railroads trying to respond to that.
Other questions?
Sorry, just a quick one. Sorry, Bob. James Nolan, U of S. So here's the bugaboo, and here's the research question for the grad students in the room. Rail costing, SR 318, TRB report, Wilson and Wolak, highly controversial. And if you've looked at it, you know that it's a little different econometric take on things. The Canadian agency up north of the border is trying to develop a costing model for interswitching. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. What would you gents do to build a better costing model? Or, subject to Gerard's comments, would you build a better costing model at this point?
Well, the biggest problem we have at the agency is that we have this 180 threshold in the law, and that, because of history, is based on the idea that it's a variable cost system, not a marginal cost system. And because of the way regulatory costing has been done, it includes some return on road property investment and equipment. So it's not a pure economic cost system the way that you might do if you were doing a good econometric model like Wilson and Wolak would want to do. So until we change the law, at least from the agency's perspective, we still need this kind of hybrid approach because it's based on a political compromise. It's not an economic decision.
I greatly admire the work that the NAS committee did. And I know Frank and Wes and I have been friends for 30 years, and they did some incredibly good work. They had a luxury that you all never had at the STB, and that is they were given a blank piece of paper and said, what would be the very best thing you can do? And you're exactly right. I mean, the need to do costing is part of the statute, and to change the use of costing parameters would require a statutory change. Could IRCs be improved on? My guess is absolutely, but it takes resources to do that.
Other thoughts, Russ?
Well, this does get into the broader question of why are we estimating costs? Yep. And I think both Bill and Mark are assuming, as I am, that probably the main regulatory reason for estimating costs has to do with protecting shippers and at least having some kind of residual price regulation to protect those who need it, even in the post-Staggers area. I've written an article saying that the standalone cost test is not the best idea. In that article and in a couple of other articles, I've argued that it's a political question. All economists I know like Ramsey pricing. If you want to have a limit on Ramsey pricing based on people who have the most inelastic demand, that's a political issue, not an economic issue. And so then the question is, where do you, as a political matter, put a limit on the ability of a railroad to Ramsey price? If you think, as the ICC and STB do, that Ramsey pricing is in general a good idea. I argued that maybe the least worst idea would be a certain markup over measured costs, maybe different by commodity. In that case, you would want to measure costs as well as you could, and if you could, maybe you would change the statutory authority. But to me, it comes down here not to the economic question, but the political question. What are you trying to do? If what you're trying to do is limit the ability of companies with market power that you want to be able to Ramsey price, but limit their ability to Ramsey price, then let's have that on the table and talk about why and how we do that.
Other questions? Bob Gallimore.
Bob Gallimore, retired, thankfully. I would like to say one thing about the history of the application by the Surface Transportation Board of the merger standards. I find it fascinating, and this is to partly correct a comment that was made earlier, I think. It seems to me that the problem of mergers was out of hand back at the time the Penn Central was passed, and since then it's steadily gotten better. The Russ's article about the SFSP, right? SPSF.
SFSP.
Yeah. Or it was the SPSF, don't paint so fast, right? That turned a corner. The article by, I think it was Friedlander, Brandt, and Velturo said that the changes in the last, since the turning of the millennium, have been 8 parts deregulation, I think they said, and 1 part mergers, and the point I would like to compliment the STB on, in addition to turning down the one really bad proposal, was to require, through the trackage rights extension requirements, those big mergers, even though they were concentrating the industry, had so many trackage rights requirements in them. I argued that the industry came out more competitive afterward than it was at the beginning, including when Conrail was divided between NS and CSX to basically reverse the one abomination in the history of Penn Central merger. So what,
Was there a question?
have I asked a single question today?
No.
I've done nothing but make comments.
Thank you for your insights. We've got time for, I think, one more question, and if no one else is going to ask it, I'll ask it, but I want to defer to you if you got a question.
May I continue? I'll make it into a question format, okay? Why, and it may be that same National Academy's report. Why do these experts continue to say that we should turn all of this over to the Justice Department instead of the STB, when I'm arguing that the STB's done a bang-up job?
Question. Bill? Should we hand everything over to the DOJ? I know what Russ's answer is. He wants to continue to be employed. So.
I may give you a different answer than what you think.
All right.
Why don't you let Russ go first?
Well, Russ, you go
All
first
right.
then.
I have argued for years that as the industry has become more and more concentrated, and we'll talk about that later, Bob, the industry, the people I know in the industry have become more and more willing, more and more open to the idea of the Department of Justice getting merger authority. And my argument is a very cynical one, that in the face of an end-to-end transcontinental merger, DOJ would only be looking at a loss of competition, and STB would be looking at a public interest.
Yep.
Now, traditionally, when DOJ looks at a loss of competition, we have looked at simply shippers who lose service by a certain number of railroads. You can imagine, speaking unofficially, you could imagine a Clayton Act examination that said if you got down to a certain number of very big railroads, you would lose competition of locating industrial plants, of responding to requirements for positive train control. You can imagine a number of other ways that a very small number of railways might reduce competition, but not in ways that I know of that's ever been adjudicated. So my cynical take is that the railways have assumed that DOJ would have a harder time blocking transcontinental mergers than STB would, and therefore they have been more open to the idea.
This is also Russ's last day at the Department of Justice.
Real quick, John, I think this brings up an important issue because my understanding is in the DOJ merger evaluation process is that the first thing that you do is go through market definition issues and try and define the correct market before you assess how competitive the post-merger situation would be. If you're good economics is good economics. If you're going to have this conversation, I don't think you can have it without talking about product and geographic substitutes. I realize that may mean more statutory change, but.
Other thoughts? Final question? Let me just close with one question because we talked a little bit about the independence of the agency, of regulation of the agency. As I look across the various regulatory agencies in this city, there are differences in the degree to which economics plays a central role in the agency. I guess I would say at places like the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, economics is revered, if not just admired. And at other agencies, let's go to the Federal Communications Commission, less of an economics emphasis. The new chairman there, Ajit Pai, has affirmatively said he wants to restructure the FCC to heighten the role of economics in the telecommunications space. Are there changes that we should think about in terms of the emphasis on economic analysis when it comes to the rail industry? Gerard, and then let's go on down the road, and then that'll be it.
Yeah, so two things. One, more generally in transportation, this is a world of civil engineers. I mean, there are probably 100, and Bob Gallimore can address this as well, 100 centers for transportation studies at 100 universities in this country. And probably there are 1,000 civil engineering professors associated with them, and maybe 100 or 50 economists associated with them. So, and the focus in this country in transportation is building capacity, and engineers know how to build capacity, and that's what happens. So you're sort of working against a culture, number one. But two, it seems to me that there certainly could be more economic analysis. And I go back to your first question. It would be good, I think, if the STB, and I agree with Bob that STB has really done an amazing job since 1980 in keeping the wolves at bay and letting the industry evolve. And I'm not sure that bringing in more economists would necessarily make that happen, but more capability at STB in terms of understanding, again, the demand side, the shippers, why industries use railroads, what are the characteristics of those industries, understanding rail markets in terms of the industries that are involved with railroads in those markets, not just the cost structure or the operational structure of the railroads.
I think it really depends on who the commissioners are at the STB, and so you're going to get a different tone at the agency when Frank Mulvey, who's a PhD economist, is chairman, or Darius Gaskins is chairman, than if you have somebody who's an attorney as chairman. So I think that when those two positions get filled, more consideration should be given that one of them should be a PhD or equivalent style economist. The other thing I would point out, there's a practical problem at the STB, that it's a lot more difficult to hire an economist or a financial analyst or somebody with statistical skills than it is to hire an attorney. So these days, when it's hard for attorneys to find jobs, the STB typically gets hundreds of applications every time it has an opening. The last time I went out for economists, I got maybe 6 reasonable applications. And if there is some way that the hiring process could be simplified for getting analytical types in the agency, that would be a big benefit.
I work in one of those research centers, and one of my colleagues and dear friends has an alias for my email. It's Token Economist. Engineers and attorneys believe they understand economics because they have checking accounts. I think
That's a quote for the day, John.
I think the notion that you can do this without economic analysis underlying it is just as valid as the notion that I can inspect a bridge that you're going to take a locomotive across. I'm done.
That's great. I wanted to end there. I'm sorry. Russ, you do get last word.
You mind if I just have a couple things?
Please.
To repeat what I said earlier in a different context, it depends on what you're trying to do. We're economists here. We all believe that public policy will be made more intelligently if economists have a role. Now, having said that, and again, since it's my last day at DOJ, I'll speak freely. You mentioned the FCC chairman who wants to increase the role of economics. What you didn't mention is he said why he wants to increase the role of economics. He wants to have more cost-benefit analysis to block regulations. Now that is a good, solid, 37-year-old American tradition, starting with the Reagan administration and OMB, of doing more cost-benefit analysis for the purpose of blocking regulations. I understand that people who are doing it wouldn't phrase it quite like that, but that has been, in many cases, its expressed role. In fact, the AAR, my good friends at the AAR, after the election said, we hope there's going to be more cost-benefit analysis now, so we won't have so many of these crazy regulations. So if the answer is we want more economists so we can do cost-benefit analysis to block regulations, I'm not as excited about it.
Okay, I didn't think we would get complete unanimity. We didn't. Russ's last answer provokes another year of conversations that he and I are going to have in the hallways. Come back next year and see who's won that debate. Let me ask you to help me thank our panel.